A janitor kneels at a forgotten grave for the 520th Sunday in a row, but this time he doesn't get back up. And when the Pentagon finally opens his jacket, they freeze. That's the line that sparked headlines. But before all that, before the medals, before Arlington and the cameras and the folded flag, there was just a man, a quiet morning, and a grave no one else remembered. It began like it always did, a low creak of the iron gate, the crunch of gravel under old tires, the soft shuffle of shoes across dew-wet grass. He walked slowly, not from hesitation, but from habit. The limp in his right leg was old now, softened by time and silent pain. A black coffee thermos stayed warm on the truck's dashboard. No one saw him arrive. No one ever did. The cemetery lay just off Route 19 past a rusting truck stop and a billboard advertising a local bait shop that had closed years ago. The grave sat near the back, where trees reached over the stone like silent sentinels. Time had eaten away at the name etched into the marble. Rain had softened the letters, and the moss had made meals of the cracks. But he always found it, always brushed away the vines, wiped the topsoil from the surface with the sleeve of his coat, and placed whatever bouquet he could find, sometimes wild marigolds, sometimes just a handful of dandelions picked along the roadside. He never spoke more than 6 words. He'd kneel, lay the flowers, and murmur, "You're not forgotten. Not this week." That's all. Then he'd sit nearby, sometimes scribbling into a leather notebook older than most of the headstones around him, sometimes just watching the branches sway. For 10 years, he did this. Rain, snow, after his stroke, after the VA stopped returning his calls, after the janitor job became more of a courtesy than employment. Most people in town thought he was strange but harmless. That old guy who mops floors and never talks, the students would whisper. The vice principal once asked if he'd considered retiring, citing safety concerns. He just nodded and kept replacing chalk trays no one used anymore. They didn't know his name was Raymond Navarro. They didn't know he once had another name, a service number, a past buried deeper than any casket in that cemetery. And they certainly didn't know about the grave. Not until a jogger, someone from out of town, just passing through, paused near the gate one Sunday, catching his breath after a steep hill. That jogger glanced inside, saw the figure kneeling in the mud, and moved by the quiet reverence of it, took a photo. It wasn't meant to go viral, but it did. A caption was added, "Man leaves flowers at the same forgotten grave for 10 years. No hashtags, no backstory, just curiosity wrapped in pixels and posted into the endless scroll. Ray didn't have social media. He still paid bills at the post office, still used a flip phone. When asked, he'd just say he didn't trust screens. But someone saw that photo, someone in uniform, someone who recognized the grave, not just the name carved into it, but the silence around it. 3 days later, when the local police found Ray slumped against the tombstone, flowers still in hand, coat soaked with last night's rain, it was assumed he was homeless. Just another forgotten soul in a forgotten place. They unzipped his coat, trying to find ID. That's when they found the envelope. Faded, worn, addressed not to a person but to a unit. Third Recon, inside a sealed folder. Red stamp, to be opened only in the event of death. No one expected what happened next. Not the officer who called the Pentagon out of protocol. Not the woman at the switchboard who took the call. Not even the administrator who had to relay the coordinates of the grave. When the line went silent on the other end, that's when everything shifted. Because this wasn't just a dead man at a grave. This was something else. Something that made 2 Marines in dress blues appear in town just before dawn, their sedan humming like a ghost through empty streets. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to that first Sunday, 10 years earlier. Ray hadn't meant to find the grave. He was looking for his cousin's marker, a simple thing, under a maple tree near the fence. Got lost, wandered too far. The cemetery was bigger than he remembered, or maybe just more overgrown. He stumbled across it by accident. The name caught him off guard. Lieutenant J. Moore, USMC. No decorations, no visitors, no flag. He stood there for a while, unsure why the silence around the stone pressed so hard against his chest. He didn't know Moore, had never heard of him, but something about the way the headstone leaned slightly, as if even death had forgotten to hold him upright, stirred something in him. That week, he returned. No plan, just returned. Picked some flowers from the roadside, left them there. Whispered something he couldn't remember later. It wasn't a vow, not yet. But the next Sunday he came back, and the one after that, and then it became routine, a ritual, a penance, maybe, or a promise. In his notebook, he began to write short letters, one each week, nothing grand, no poetry, just thoughts, memories, fragments, sometimes addressed to Moore, sometimes to himself, sometimes to no one at all. One of the earliest entries read, "I didn't save him, but I remember." Ray had a drawer full of medals, never displayed them. A closet with an old uniform, still folded, still clean, still holding the weight of names never spoken again. The grave became his place of reckoning, a confessional made of moss and stone. He never told anyone about it. The janitor didn't need friends, didn't go to the VFW, didn't speak at Memorial Day events. When asked if he served, he just shrugged. Long time ago, he'd say, but that wasn't the whole truth. See, the story doesn't begin with a man dying at a grave. It begins with a man living at one, week after week, wordlessly fighting to preserve the name of someone no one else remembered. It begins with a simple act of defiance against forgetting, against the world's relentless erosion of meaning. Ray Navarro never raised his voice, never asked for recognition, but for 10 years he showed up. That's the part people forget when they share the viral clip, when they post the ceremony footage with hashtags and flags. Before the foldable chairs, before the rifle salute, before the marble was cleaned and the name re-engraved, there was just a man, a lone one, kneeling, in mud, holding flowers like they mattered. And when he finally didn't rise, when his chest rose for the last time and the wind took his hat, it wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Because someone saw. And when someone sees, everything changes. Raymond Navarro never liked attention. Even as a child, he avoided the center of the room, choosing instead the corners where shadows gathered and silence made more sense than noise. That trait never left him, not during the war, not when he returned, not during the long years that stretched thin between then and now. He didn't seek spotlights or parades. He sought order, repetition, small acts of dignity. That's why being a janitor suited him. The quiet rhythm of mopping floors, tightening screws, wiping windows, tasks that didn't ask for applause, only presence. He lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a hardware store owned by a man who didn't ask questions. His rent was always on time. The lights worked. The hallway smelled of dust and old paint. It was enough. But behind that minimal life, behind the way he folded his socks with military precision and lined his canned goods by expiration date, there was something else, a thread wound tight across the years, pulling him back to one place, to one name, to one man. More, Dafa. After the first accidental visit, and the second, Ray didn't wait for Sundays to arrive. He built his week around them. The school staff never noticed. He never took days off. He never missed a shift. But his time was arranged so that Sunday mornings belonged to the cemetery. He'd wake at 500 am, press his shirt, pack a sandwich he rarely ate, and drive the same cracked road, pausing at the diner on Route 19 to buy a small coffee he never drank. The ritual was what mattered, the mechanics of reverence. Sometimes he spoke under his breath as he knelt beside Moore's grave. Not prayers, but phrases half-remembered from jungles long gone, codes, call signs, coordinates. Things no one else knew. And each time he visited, he left a new page in his notebook, a page torn neatly from the spine, folded once, and slipped beneath a stone by the marker. He never reread them, never copied them, but each one ended the same way: "You are not forgotten." Not this week. In year 4 of his visits, he noticed a dent in the headstone. It hadn't been there before, maybe from a storm or a careless mower, but it gnawed at him. He went to the local stonecutter, inquired quietly about repair. The man shook his head, said he didn't handle military stones, too much red tape, too many approvals. Ray nodded, thanked him, and left. The next week, he brought a small chisel and a bottle of cleaning solution, not to fix it, just to preserve it. When the flowers wilted too quickly, He learned which ones held up better in winter. When the wind grew cruel, he anchored the bouquet with river stones. When squirrels began to dig at the base of the grave, he scattered cayenne pepper to drive them off. These were acts of resistance, of loyalty. No one told him to do it. No one noticed, but he did it anyway. Somewhere along the year 6, the weather changed in him. His hands began to shake. A small tremor at first, easily hidden. Then more. Writing became harder. Folding paper hurt. He told no one. Instead, he adapted, wrote slower, steadier. Wrapped his fingers in athletic tape to steady the joints. A nurse at the VA clinic asked him once if he had anyone to help at home. He smiled. No, he said, but I've got things that keep me steady. She assumed he meant a walking stick. He did not. There were moments quiet, piercing ones when Ray would sit in front of Moore's grave and wonder what the man had looked like at the end. He had never seen Moore's body. Only the moment before the ambush in the jungle outside Quezon, the shout. The sound of everything exploding inward. The radio went dead. Moore had been 10 feet ahead, then gone. Ray had run back, dragged 2 others out. Never found Moore. Only a boot. Only smoke. The military said he was KIA. Ray knew that. He'd read the report. He'd written half of it, but part of him never believed it. Or maybe never forgave it. He wrote letters to Moore like the man might still read them. In one, he wrote, I don't know if you heard the last evac chopper. I waited. I told them you were right behind. I lied. I didn't know, but I wanted it to be true. In another, I kept your photo, the one by the river. I don't look at it much. Can't, but I've still got it. Those pages built up in the leather-bound notebook. Dozens of them, some stained with coffee, others warped by rain. He never threw any away. They sat in a drawer by his bed, wrapped in an old Marine Corps scarf. The janitor job became harder, but he kept at it. He liked the smell of floor wax. The quiet halls when school hadn't started yet. The way fluorescent lights flickered like bad memories. One teacher once left a thank you note taped to her door. Thank you for fixing the heater. It read, You are appreciated. Ray folded it, put it in his wallet, and carried it for the next 3 years. No one knew about the grave. No one knew about the Sunday drives. Until the jogger, until the photo, until the ripple. Ray had just returned that day, that final Sunday. He'd left the flowers like always, a mix of wild marigolds and violets. He'd placed his hand on the stone longer than usual. The tremor had grown worse. His breath had grown shallow. His pulse slowed, but he didn't notice. He had been writing one last letter. It wasn't finished. Only the first few words had made it onto the page. If this is the end, let it be here, that's all. He never made it back to the truck. The sun had risen higher by the time a groundskeeper found him, cold, silent. Still, when they unzipped his coat and found the envelope, there was confusion. A unit number A designation, no name. They debated what to do. The police made a call, just protocol. But the voice on the other end of the line had gone quiet after hearing the coordinates. They asked the officer to repeat them. Then again, 3 days later, men in dress blues knocked on a school office door. They asked for Raymond Navarro. The secretary blinked. You mean the janitor? They didn't answer. They only showed her a black and white photo of a squad of Marines, soaked in sweat and mud, smiling in the sun. In the middle, a tall man with a crooked smile had his hand resting on another Marine's shoulder. She pointed toward the maintenance closet. That's him, she whispered. But he wasn't there anymore. What followed was not public. Not yet. Files open that hadn't been touched in decades. A commendation sealed under orders of a general who disappeared in country. A deferment order signed but never delivered. A service record with entire sections blacked out. But one note stood out, in Ray's handwriting. Tucked into the envelope, he died alone. He shouldn't be remembered that way. And suddenly, Moore wasn't the only one being remembered. The Pentagon sent a car, a quiet one, black, polished, waiting at the edge of town like a storm that wore silence. They brought the flag, they brought the folder, they brought the name back into the light. But even then, Ray didn't ask for anything. He never had. He just left flowers. Every Sunday. Until one Sunday, he didn't. The black sedan moved through the neighborhood with the kind of silence that didn't belong to cars. It wasn't just the engine electric. purring low like something breathing beneath the surface. It was the way the air shifted when it passed, like the world knew to get out of its way. The neighbors watched from behind curtains, unsure what to make of the two Marines in full dress blues stepping out, their movements exact, like pages being turned in a ritual. They weren't there to deliver bad news to a family. That part had already happened. Ray Navarro was gone, but something about his departure had stirred something ancient and unfinished inside the system that had once claimed him, then lost him. Inside the house, the air still held the scent of worn books and rain-damp coats. A single coffee mug sat on the kitchen table, half full, untouched. The folder lay beside it, open now, its pages marked not by bureaucracy but by memory. Service records redacted in black ink, commendations that had never been issued, and a single photograph, the kind that shouldn't exist anymore. In the photo, 10 Marines stood shoulder to shoulder, soaked and filthy, all grinning like they'd just cheated death. Ray was second from the right. Moore stood at the center, helmet pushed back, his hand resting on Ray's shoulder like he knew the future wouldn't give him another chance. That photo had been taken in 1968, 3 days before everything went wrong. But the twist hadn't come from that photo, or the medals, or even the folder. It had come from a name. Moore, or Lieutenant James M. Moore, the one Ray had been kneeling beside for a decade. The name had triggered a security ping inside a military archive system built to forget. Moore had no known family, no next of kin. His file had been cold for decades until someone recognized the signature on one of his last letters, preserved in digital microfilm. That signature belonged to Raymond A. Navarro. What the Pentagon didn't understand yet was why Navarro had kept his silence. Why he'd never applied for veterans' benefits. Why he'd vanished from every known address after 1976. Why he'd buried himself inside the identity of a janitor and left no trace of the man he'd once been. That puzzle became a priority when the jogger's photo went viral and someone connected the quiet old man in the image to a blacked-out operations list from the Quang Tri province. The real twist, one no algorithm could predict, came when they opened the envelope found in Ray's coat. There was more than a service folder. There were letters, hundreds of them. Not official reports, not mission logs, handwritten pages, weekly reflections, confessions, maps of guilt and memory penned over 10 years of Sundays. Some addressed to Moore, others simply to you. The Pentagon reviewed them. So did a general. So did a retired intel analyst called in from Vermont who hadn't been summoned in 20 years. The conclusion wasn't military. It was human. Ray Navarro had been keeping a promise. Not to the Corps, not to the government, but to a man, to Moore. And now they had to decide what to do with that promise. They started with Arlington, but quiet calls were made. Not everyone agreed at first. Some argued Ray had gone AWOL, had walked away from a system that had trained him. Others said the medals he left behind should disqualify him from official recognition. But then they read the note again. He died alone. He shouldn't be remembered that way. And suddenly the debate wasn't about protocol. It was about memory. Moore's grave was scheduled for restoration. The stone was replaced. The name re-etched. A new flag was placed. Precise. Immaculate. But that wasn't enough. The flowers had been the key. Ray's flowers. Each one a ledger entry, a log of witness, a salute in color and silence. Someone had to account for them. They created a new designation, custodian of record. A title not written in any military handbook, but one that now belonged to Ray. Posthumously. A quiet salute to the one who had kept vigil. Then came the ceremony. Ray's name wasn't supposed to be on the program. He wouldn't have wanted it. But by the time the sun rose over Hillrest National, his absence was a presence no one could ignore. The bagpipes played. The flag was folded. The rifles fired their crisp, aching punctuation. A general stepped forward, not the kind who gave interviews. He had served in Da Nang. He knew the silence of jungles and the weight of names. He saluted the grave not once, but twice, first for Moore, then for Navarro. That was when the envelope appeared. It had been recovered during restoration, sealed with wax, untouched. On the front, "You're not forgotten." Not this week. Inside, a single page, blank. Not because Ray hadn't written anything, but because he didn't need to anymore. The decade had already spoken. And yet the moment that broke the silence wasn't orchestrated by military command. It came from a boy, 17, maybe 18, not in uniform, just a jacket, jeans, and a cheap aluminum cane. He stepped forward, voice shaking, and handed a folded paper to the general. "My father served with Lieutenant Moore," he said. "He always said, if I ever met the man who remembered him, I should say thank you." The general took the paper, opened it, then passed it to the colonel beside him. Inside a photo, Ray and Moore, sitting on sandbags, boots off, socks drying, laughing like the world hadn't ended yet. On the back, in faded ink, the watchman. That's when the name changed. Ray was no longer just a janitor, or even a veteran. He became something else, living proof that memory could outlast medals, that silence could carry more meaning than speeches, that loyalty didn't end when the orders did. They etched his name below Moore's, not as a soldier, as a witness. Raymond A. Navarro, 1943-2024, custodian of memory. It wasn't about heroism, not the kind you find in headlines or war movies. It was about something quieter, something more enduring. A few weeks later, the town's high school held a small assembly. No press, no pageantry, just a few teachers, some students, and a display table with Ray's uniform, his medals, and a notebook left open to the final page. One student, 12 years old, shy, asked if she could read it. The page was mostly blank, but one sentence had been written in clean, steady hand. "The watch ends, but the memory stands." Later that week, the teacher drove out to the cemetery with her class, not for a field trip, just to walk. Each child carried a wildflower, dandelions, violets, marigolds. They placed them gently, one by one, at the base of Moore's grave. And Ray's, no one told them to, but someone had told them the story, and now they wouldn't forget either. The morning of the ceremony was colder than expected, the kind of chill that clings to skin even through layers of wool and brass. The fog rolled in early over Hillrest National, curling between the graves like breath held too long. Soldiers in dress blues stood in perfect lines, boots polished to a mirror sheen, eyes forward, unmoving. They had practiced this, every movement timed, every pause intentional. But what they hadn't prepared for, what no training manual could teach, was the feeling that hung over them like low thunder that today. They were not just burying a man, they were closing a loop opened 50 years ago. Not in war, but in silence. The crowd that had gathered was small at first. Military brass, a few retired Marines, local officials. But then they started to come. From across the town, teachers who had worked with Ray but never really known him. Students who remembered a quiet man who fixed desks and swept chalk dust from forgotten corners. Neighbors who had passed him on the street for years, nodding politely, never asking anything more. A bus arrived, unannounced, carrying a dozen veterans from 3 states away. Men with canes, some with oxygen tanks, one with no legs. No one had told them to come. They just had. No one said Ray's name at first. It was all about Moore, about his service, his sacrifice, his valor. The standard words, the script, but then the colonel cleared his throat, paused, and looked down at the folder he held in both hands like it was a living thing. He turned the page. There was no speech written there, just a photo, Ray and Moore, and again, on those sandbags in Quangtree. The colonel looked up. "We thought this story was about Lieutenant Moore," he said, his voice steady but softer now. "But it's also about the man who never let him disappear." He stepped aside. Another man walked forward, older, civilian clothes, a slight limp. He didn't wear any medals, but the lines on his face carried their own weight. He introduced himself as Father Callahan, the chaplain from Ray's unit, long retired. His hands trembled as he adjusted the mic. "I remember them both," he said, eyes not on the crowd but somewhere far behind it. Moore was a compass. Ray was the anchor. He paused. "You don't always notice the anchor until the storm hits." Silence. Then a voice from the crowd. A boy, maybe 12, stepped forward. Not part of the ceremony, just holding a flower. "He used to clean our desks," he said, nervous, but firm. "Every day, even when no one thanked him." The colonel gestured gently. Inviting him forward, the boy laid the flower at the base of the new headstone, then turned back without a word. It was a small gesture, but it cracked something open. A woman stepped forward next. She had been a teacher at Westport High for 15 years. She spoke of a day when the heating system failed and Ray spent 8 hours fixing it with his bare hands, never once complaining. I offered him coffee. She said, he smiled like that meant the world. I never knew. Her voice broke. The stories began to flood out, quiet at first, then steadier, one after another. People spoke not of battles, not of glory, but of the little things. The broken lockers Ray had repaired. The mornings he'd shoveled snow from the school steps before anyone arrived. The way he nodded instead of speaking. How he always held the door open too long. How he always seemed to be listening even when no one was talking. No one knew about the grave. No one had asked where he disappeared to every Sunday. But now, standing there in the cold morning light, with a wreath fresh as breath and a name carved in stone, they began to understand that he had been carrying more than keys and mops. He had been carrying a legacy. And then came the twist. An archivist from the Pentagon, young, fresh-faced, suit too big for his shoulders, stepped up and handed the colonel a sealed document. It had just been declassified that morning. The colonel broke the seal and read aloud. It was a commendation, not for valor in combat, but for sustained moral vigilance in the preservation of honor. The language was formal, almost clinical, but the meaning was anything but. Ray Navarro had been recognized by the Department of Defense as a custodian of legacy, a protector of the fallen. And yet, even that wasn't what changed everything. It happened when the band began to play taps. The lone bugle pierced the silence with its mournful clarity. Ray's shadow box sat atop a black cloth-draped pedestal beside Moore's, the metals inside polished for the first time in decades. No one touched them. No one needed to. At the final note, a young man in a green ROTC uniform stepped forward. His salute was shaky. He was barely 19. But when he turned to the crowd, his voice didn't falter. My grandfather served with Lieutenant Moore. He said there was a man on his team who always stayed behind to make sure no one got left. He never told us his name, just said, "The watchman will remember when the world forgets." He looked at Ray's grave. Now we remember too. And just like that, something shifted. The silence turned into something sacred. One by one, children began to walk forward. Each carried a wildflower, dandelions, violets, marigolds. No one had planned it. The flowers weren't part of the program, but somehow they all knew. They'd heard the story. From teachers, from parents, from someone who had whispered it the way truths are passed quietly. But with fire, each child laid their flower at the grave, then stepped back. The line was long. It didn't end quickly. And then, when the last flower had been placed, the colonel stepped forward one final time. "We live in a world that forgets too quickly," he said. "But today we remember a man who refused to forget, a man who chose quiet over recognition, service over pride, memory over medals." He turned, removed a flag from its case, and presented it to an empty chair, the one that would have been Ray's. "For 10 years, you stood watch," he said, "and now we stand for you." The final note of the ceremony was not a bugle, not a speech. It was the sound of wind moving through the trees, carrying with it the weight of memory like a name being whispered from one generation to the next. Ray Navarro was no longer just a name in a folder. He had become something else, a symbol, a sentinel. A quiet storm that reminded everyone watching that honor wasn't always loud. Sometimes it just left flowers and waited. That night, after the crowd had left and the wind settled into a gentler rhythm, the cemetery stood quiet again. The grass was damp with dew, and a faint scent of polished stone and turned earth lingered in the air. The flags had been collected. The rifle casings from the salute had been pocketed by silent hands. And yet, something about the ground itself felt changed, like it had exhaled a memory it had carried for too long. Back in town, the streets were still. Shop signs dimmed, and the old hardware store beneath Ray's apartment had its lights off, just like always. But in the window of the second floor, there was a glow a single lamp left on, casting long shadows over the simple furniture inside. A shadow box now rested beneath that light, Inside it were two medals, one silver, one bronze positioned carefully beside a photograph that had faded more from time than neglect. In it, two young men sat side by side, smiling at something beyond the frame, their boots off, socks drying, eyes bright with the impossible belief that maybe they would all make it home. Beside the box, a leather-bound notebook lay open for its final page already written. Ray's handwriting was steady, more deliberate than usual, as if he knew he wouldn't get another chance to revise the words. It read, "The watch ends, but the memory stands." He hadn't dated it. He didn't need to. The town hadn't expected the effect the ceremony would have. In the days that followed, the story spread, not the viral kind that burns bright for a day and then vanishes, but the slower, more lasting kind. Whispered from person to person, folded into morning conversations and evening prayers. Ray's photo began to appear not just in military circles or history blogs, but in classrooms. Teachers used it to explain not war, but duty. Not medals, but the quiet courage of showing up even when no one is watching. A local artist painted a mural near the school's south wall. It showed Ray not as a janitor, not as a Marine, but as a man kneeling by a grave. Wildflowers in one hand, notebook in the other. Behind him, the silhouettes of others, men and women who had been lost, forgotten, unnamed, rose like ghosts, not in sorrow but in gratitude. The mural was titled simply "The Watchman." At first, some thought the attention would fade, another week, another headline, but it didn't. Something about the story stuck. Maybe because it wasn't loud. Maybe because it didn't try to be. Ray hadn't posted videos. He hadn't spoken at conferences. He had just shown up, again and again. And now, others began to follow. Every Sunday, someone new came to the grave. At first, it was the veterans who had known more or thought they might have. Then it was students from the high school, bringing flowers and handmade bouquets tied with string. Then parents, teachers, strangers who had seen a version of the story online, unsure why they had been moved to tears but compelled to come anyway. The notebook, returned by military officials to the school, was placed in a glass case in the library. Students were allowed to read it under supervision. They weren't told to memorize names or dates. They were just asked to read one page, any page, and write a letter in response. The box filled quickly. Hundreds of notes. "Thank you for remembering. I won't forget either. Your silence taught me more than words ever could." One day, a girl left a single line on the back of her letter. "Maybe I can be someone's watchman too." The military had never prepared for this kind of response. They issued a formal commendation. They offered to name a scholarship after Ray. The town accepted. But the principal of the school said something in a meeting that reshaped the conversation. He said, "We can name buildings, but I think Ray would have preferred we teach what he lived." So they did. A new curriculum was developed, not just about war or service, but about legacy, about choosing to act when no one asks you to, about bearing witness, about love, even if you never use the word. Moore's grave became a site of memory, not because he had commanded armies or changed policy, but because one man had refused to let him fade. The words etched on the stone now read, "Lieutenant James M. Moore, USMC, 1944 to 1968. Remembered, always." Beneath it, a second line had been added in honor of Raymond A. Navarro, who remembered when the world forgot. And beneath that, one more added by a child, written in chalk every Sunday before the groundskeeper gently washes it clean again. Not this week. There was no official announcement about who would take Ray's place. No sign-up sheet, no assigned roles. But the ritual continued. One week, a retired nurse brought daisies. The next, a college student left pressed lavender between the stone and a folded note. No one claimed leadership. That was the point. Legacy had become a loop, handed gently from one soul to another. And far away, in a quiet room inside the Pentagon, an officer, one of the few who had reviewed Ray's file from the beginning, sat at his desk staring at a final memo. It wasn't marked urgent. It wasn't even typed. It was a handwritten summary on plain paper, a personal reflection he didn't plan to send up the chain. It read, "Sometimes it's not the war that shapes a man, it's the silence afterward." Navarro chose to answer that silence with presence. He gave meaning back to something we had lost. Maybe that's what honor really is, not the medals we award, but the memories we keep. He folded the note, slipped it into a file marked closed, and turned off the light. Outside, the world moved on, but something stayed behind. In a graveyard off Route 19 in the shadow of trees older than any war, wildflowers still appear every Sunday. They come in quiet, no announcements, no flags waving, just footsteps on wet grass, the creak of a gate, the sound of someone kneeling. The watch had ended, but the memory stood, and it always will.